Hey Grauwelt fans, today I wanted to talk to you about world building, but before we get started I want to give you a quick update on my writing of the second Grauwelt novel. I just started chapter 10 out of 47 that I outlined earlier, and I'm averaging about 2 or 3 chapters I would say a week on the first draft. And I honestly need to pick up the pace a little to reach my target date, but all in all I think it's going pretty smoothly. So as I'm writing the second Grauwelt novel, this comes up really often, and that's the concept of world building. World building is giving a work of fiction a sense of kind of completeness, like it's a real place that we could actually visit somehow. And for me, it's really what makes or breaks a piece of fiction, and as a writer, I find it the single most fun part. I think it's more fun than, for me, coming up with a good plot. It's more fun than coming up with characters. It's definitely the setting itself that brings work alive, at least in my mind. And for me, the setting is kind of a character in and of itself. It's probably the most important character, and that's why it's really essential to get world building correct. Now, I made a previous video about the techniques that I use for world building, and I'll link to that in the video itself and also in the description. But today I wanted to focus on another more specific aspect of world building, and that's infusing your world building in a story with a sense of largerness, if you will. So making the setting feel larger than it actually is, larger than you're going to go through all the pains to explain. Because the problem is, it's really easy to get carried away. In the last Grauwelt novel, we had to cut out about 80 pages. My editors, all 3 of them, gave me a lot of different pointers about how to cut out a lot of stuff, and I was really sad to see a lot of it go because there was a lot more world building, there's a lot more exposition, there were some characters there that you didn't get to see in the draft that became the book itself. And it's really easy to get carried away with just wanting to show the readers all the great things that exist in your world. And that's why it's important to just make the world a lot of times feel like it's larger without actually going through all the trouble to show everyone, because honestly a reader can lose interest. As interesting as a fantasy or sci-fi setting can be, it can also be really off-putting to have to just read so much exposition, even though, you know, the writer might find the world interesting, and I definitely found every single word that I wrote interesting. The reader's probably going to think likewise. So there are a couple of different ways that you can kind of make a world feel like it's actually larger than it really is. And a lot of it has to revolve around allusions to different people, different places, different institutions, customs, languages, that sort of thing. So you don't have to go to the trouble of going over all the different forms of dress and the way that people speak and where they live. You just need to drop specific names in a place that feels really natural. So for example, in the first Grauwelt novel, The Sword and Its Servant, we get to hear about a couple of things that we don't actually get to see or really know anything about. The first one that comes to mind is the mention of the War of the 30 Scepters. The 2 antagonist brothers, Ulf and Gestalt, kind of have one of their many bitter exchanges amongst each other. And Ulf mentions that Gestalt wasn't even present to fight in the War of 30 Scepters. So that's all they say about it. You don't actually get to hear what was the War of 30 Scepters, who fought. Obviously Ulf was there and Gestalt wasn't. Where was it fought? Who won? You really don't get any of that. And you don't need to, because no one would go to the length to describe it. If I tell you, you weren't in Vietnam or World War II, I don't need to explain to you. It's given that you and I who live in this world already know what that was. We wouldn't go to the pains to describe, okay, well, it started when Germany moved into Poland and et cetera, et cetera. You don't need to go to that extreme to explain it every single time. It's because we live in this world, we take it for granted, we know that information. So likewise, in a fantasy or sci-fi setting, you make it look as though, there's this larger history and world that exists. And the characters, since they know it, and the reader doesn't know it, and even the writer doesn't need to know it, you just create this illusion that there's more than meets the eye, so to speak. A couple other examples I can think of from the first Grauwelt book was you get mentions of creatures like the Cinders and the Plucks. You get mentions of locations like the Daland and the Underdeep. And the characters kind of talk about these different things and places, but you don't really get an explanation of what they are. The really key point is to just make them feel as though they're natural parts of the world and natural parts of speech. Again, just make the characters take it for granted. They don't need to explain it to each other because they already know. Another world building technique that I did use in the first Grauwelt novel, and as I'm writing the second one, find that I need to use a lot more. Not that dropping names and places and things doesn't help, but because now the story is moved outside of the starting location in the Kaltstein, and it's moving through the hinterlands of the Grauwelt itself, you're going to get exposed to a lot of new life, a lot of new creatures, a lot of new characters and locations. And because of that, you need to make them, or I should say I have to make them very different from what we've seen before, but still kind of fit within the same universe. So one of the principal ways that I'm working to do that is with some of the sentient characters. You're going to have different Loa characters, and a really great way to show kind of variations in one species, for example, is modes of dress. What do they wear? Do they wear jewelry? Is it made out of different materials? What kind of colors do they favor? What color is their skin? Do they have slightly different heights? And also an interesting one is, do they have a different way of speaking? It's easy to get carried away in making the differences too stark. For example, let's just use a real-world example. The difference between the way that I dress here in the United States around the Washington, D.C. area and the way that someone in Seattle, Washington on the other side of the country, or London, England, let's say, on the other side of the Atlantic, isn't that much different. There are a couple of subtle variations. Maybe if you're familiar with clothing and fashion, you might be able to pick out, well, oh, this is only available in the United States, or this person got it from this store. I mean, there are tiny little hints of difference, and it's really important to be subtle that way. A more obvious difference would be in the way that people speak. It can be an accent, it can be word choice. The kind of basic underpinnings, the language, let's say English in this case, is the same in all these locations that I've mentioned in the United States and in the UK, in Canada and South Africa and Australia, all those places. The English language is virtually the same, but there are really small shades of difference. And even if you weren't familiar with people from different parts of the English-speaking world, if you heard them speak and you saw their appearance, you would be able to notice really tiny variations. So even without knowing anything about them, you get a broader sense of, okay, well, the English language is obviously very widespread because you have all these different ways of speaking. People look a little different, they dress a little different. So you don't have to get to know all of the nuances of where these people come from and what they're about, although you should in real life. That's a good thing to do. But you already get a sense very quickly that the world from which these people come is varied and much larger than you yourself are able to see right away. One of the things I decided really early on, this is something that I thought of even before I started writing, was that there had to be a way that some of the characters spoke that was different, so it made it feel familiar enough that it's in English, we can all understand it, but it had to be different enough so that it felt a little otherworldly. There was an otherworldly quality to it, and what I decided to do is kind of the use of contractions. We all use contractions. I think I use them often. I'm sure there are a lot of them in this video. Things like, you don't always say I cannot, you say I can't, or I do not, you say I don't. Now, some of the characters in the Grauwelt series, like Klein, for those of you who have read it, he doesn't use any contractions at all. There's not a single contraction in anything that he's ever said. And I did that specifically so that his language would sound older, kind of harken to a time before there were contractions in English at all, or at least not the ones that we know today. So I think that came off pretty effectively. I just eliminated all contractions, so everything he says sounds really formal, at least more formal than the other characters, and so it kind of sounds old because his age is like indeterminable, right? He's like super ancient from a really long time ago. So that was one of the ways that I tried to give a sense of agelessness to that character. And another kind of different use of contractions came with the Loa characters. Again, most of the human characters are from our world, and the Loa are from the Grauwelt. And so I wanted to give them a little bit of a different method of speech. Some of the words they use are a little bit archaic, you could say. We're not used to hearing them so much, at least in everyday conversation. And I also did something with the way that they use their contractions. For example, if I asked you, have you been to New York City before, and you haven't gone, you would probably say to me, I have not been, or I haven't been. So you make a contraction of have and not. Those two become one word. The Loa would say, I've not been. They contract I and have together to make I've. And that today, at least as far as I know in English, and the English that I speak and is spoken around me, that's a little bit more archaic, that's a little bit out of the ordinary, and it does sound a little bit different, a little bit older, if you will. And so I was very cautious as to make all the contractions that the Loa characters speak kind of sound like that. So it made it just sound just a touch different from what you're used to hearing, and I think it fit in really well with the world itself, and just enough otherworldliness so that you're not alienated and you can't understand what they're saying, but at the same time it does make it feel different. And again, that's, you don't have to show how their language evolved differently, or how it's different in any way. You just tweak a little tiny thing and you allude to an entire history, really. I mean, it's up to whoever reads it to decide how all these things came to be. That's why world building is absolutely so fun, is because there's so much speculation. You set up, a writer will set up these conditions and purposefully not explain fully everything, and then you're left wondering, like, what does this mean? Where did this character come from? Who won that battle? Where did this, migration pattern happen? Who are these gods? What language did these people speak before, the invasion came? And you can just have so many different speculations, and that's really half the fun of not only writing, but reading too. When you're reading something, I would hate to see everything just laid out in a way as if it were nonfiction, which I love nonfiction, but at the same time, in a fictional setting, half the fun is just speculating, letting your imagination run wild within the boundaries that the author has given you. Then you can just talk to your friends, and you guys can have like opposing theories about what all this stuff means, and that's really the most rewarding part for me as a writer, and the biggest payoff for me as a reader of sci-fi and fantasy. I like to see the author allude to a larger world than we actually get shown. In closing, I'd like to invite all of you to the Grauwelt.com website. With all the video posts, I also do a companion article on the website. I'll link to it in the description at the bottom of the video, and also in the video itself. And the companion article kind of summarizes what I say in these videos, and then also goes into more depth. Not everything can be explained in a video, and not everything can be explained in text, and I think that they kind of complement each other really well, so I'll put that link there. I definitely encourage you guys to check it out. Like and share this video if you liked it, and don't forget to subscribe to the Grauwelt channel. I'll talk to you guys next time. Bye.